Greetings. My name is Chantal Forbes, and the title of my presentation today is Becoming Earth, Prehumanistic Consciousness and Transspecies Sentience in the Practice of Tracking. This presentation examines the phenomena of inter- and transspecies transference, or ontological assimilation of sentience experienced during the practice of cross-species tracking. Drawing from historical analysis of the science and art of tracking amongst hunter-gatherer communities in Southern Africa, this presentation seeks to demonstrate that cross-species tracking facilitates an ontological process of trans-species ambiguity between humans and more than humans that underpins a prehumanistic consciousness critical to our continued posthumanistic existence as ecological species. The theoretical exploration of this work draws on both new materialist and new animist theory, using anthropologist Mathias Guenther's animistic relational models of ontological fluidity among hunter-gatherer communities. Through these models, this presentation demonstrates that the ontological fluidity facilitated by ontological ambiguity performs the somatic intuitive function of assimilating one's multidimensional environment, engaging different physical, emotional, and mythological aspects of the body and consciousness. This presentation concludes that the transspecies sentience experienced during tracking through this process informs a metaphysics of becoming Earth, where a post-humanist future depends on a pre-humanist understanding of interspecies consciousness. This presentation is based on my ongoing research, which weaves together tenets of new animism, posthumanism, and relational ontology to engage a philosophical analysis of transspecies ontology, mainly amongst Southern African indigenous or First Peoples. Here I engage in both philosophical and anthropological readings of archival studies and ongoing scholarship about Southern African hunter-gatherer perspectives on the mutability of ontological boundaries between humans and other than humans. These perspectives derive from more than 70 years of ethnographic materials conducted amongst several communities with distinct identities who are collectively referred to as San in post-colonial academic literature. Additionally, colloquial and academic terms that may be used or are used in this literature include Bushman, Khoi, or Khoisan. Each term is historically and politically complex, and each term further emerges from the ongoing racial effects of colonial contexts. So I'll begin here with the question of how and why tracking is a pre-humanist technology with adaptive post-humanist potential. I'll explore this at the intersection of tracking as a science and as a metaphysical practice. Philosophically, posthumanism can be understood as an epistemic adaptive technology that has the potential to establish societies of sentient planetary relations through what Brodotti frames as Earth-centered radical immanence that decenters humanism. Within this same context, prehumanism is not a particular time before the sapient or the sentient experience of sapience. Rather, it is any time that was experienced before or is now experienced outside of the dominant scientific materialism of humanism that governs and reinforces the culture-nature divide. Articulated in another way, prehumanism is not necessarily synonymous with the evolutionary frameworks of prehistoric or Paleolithic. Instead, prehumanism is a possibility of being that is variously expressed throughout different time periods in different parts of the world. Here, the pre and the posthumanism do not exist along a evolutionary linear time frame. Instead, they manifest as psychological states of being that inform lived societal experiences where they serve similar functions in that they decenter human exceptionalism and recenter the exceptionalism of sentient planetary communities that co-emerge through relational assemblages in space and time. The practice of one sentient species tracking another is considered an ancestral skill that is fundamental to the historical survival of a multi-species community of beings, of which the sapient forms a part. I first encountered the study of tracking through the study of hunter-gatherer hunting practices amongst the Kalahari San in southern Africa. Tracking is central to all forms of hunting, and the San are widely considered to be one of the first master trackers on Earth. Evolutionary cyber tracker Louis Liebenberg has conducted the most extensive and comprehensive quantitative studies on tracking and hunting amongst the San of Southern Africa. He has written books on the art of tracking and the origins of science, and posits that tracking is the first scientific practice, with persistence hunting, where the hunter runs down an animal of prey, being a critical agent in developing this practice. Liebenberg describes three kinds of tracking from a scientific perspective. Simple tracking, which is the practice of following obvious tracks or signs. Systematic tracking, which involves systematically gathering information from signs until a detailed indication is built up of what the animal is doing and where it is going. And thirdly, speculative tracking involves creating a hypothesis based on an initial interpretation of signs, knowledge of animal behavior, and knowledge of the landscape. Through a hypothetical reconstruction of the animal's activities, the trackers look for signs where they expect or assume to find the animal. Liebenberg hypothesizes that speculative tracking evolved from tracking in challenging ecological environments, like the semi-arid environment of the Kalahari Desert. Liebenberg explains that, quote, hunting and gathering economies had a local character in that hunter-gatherers adapted themselves quite differently to the different ecological areas of the Kalahari. Ecological adaptation involved specialized knowledge about a given area. Reading animal tracks entails interpreting the world from weather to stratigraphy and ethology, end quote. And as Lowe comments, if you ask a San person how they track, they will tell you they just follow the tracks. To put these trackers' knowledge of animal behavior into perspective, one must assume their point of view. Trackers spend many hours discussing the habits and movements of animals through ongoing daily conversations, folklore, songs, and other ritualized and performative actions. To understand animals, the trackers must identify themselves with an animal. Lowe argues that for San trackers, most of their analysis is felt and unspoken, where metaphorical relationships are rooted in actual relational realities. He adds that San's belief about the flowing and ambiguous nature of spirit or essence provides an understanding that one thing can be another despite external appearances. It is here at this point that we begin to transition to the metaphysics of tracking. Numerous anthropologists have emphasized San identification as one of being a hunter or tracker, which, as one tracker defined, is to be a knower of nature and to hold the knowledge of your environment in both your mind and your body. In the era of bordered landscapes of self-presenting democratic states, being a tracker is still a key identifier for many San of what it means to be a human, even if they are now restricted from hunting. Interestingly, unlike song, dance, and storytelling, tracking allows humans to experience transspecies transference of sentience through purposely engaging an ambiguous and fluid ontological openings with other species in a non-performative manner. As Barnard, Guenther, and others have illustrated, San cosmology is uniquely replete in the purposeful facilitation of transspecies ontological fluidity. Beasley demonstrates this point through her analysis of San folklore, where all animals were formerly people and only later became animals. San stories deal first with animals in their human aspect, though the characters already possess traits that will be typical of their animal aspect. The characters may turn into animals when they find themselves in situations where they need their animal powers. These stories often account for the origins of different species, and although this may seem peculiar to a modern evolutionist, it is quite plausible to the trackers who identify themselves with an animal by thinking what they would do if they became that animal. Beasley's co-researchers insisted that animals were people, not humans, but people, because they too lived and thought. In other words, because they were sentient. They asserted that each species of animal had its own distinctive physical forms, customs, habits, and ways of experiencing and interacting with the world. And I quote here, for them, empathy with animals was not a question of focusing on an animal's human-like characteristics, but assuming the whole perspective of the animal. To empathize with an animal, you couldn't think like a human and project your thoughts and emotions onto it. Rather, you had to adopt the animal's perspectives. End quote. Guenther first proposed the theory of ontological ambiguity in the 1990s, following his study of Botswana's Naro people's social and religious worlds. Here, Guenther's theory privileges the mytho-mystical metaphysics of a sound worldview over a hyper-rational one, emphasizing the commonality of cosmologically informed ontological fluidity amongst pre-modern and modern sound communities that permeates day-to-day life. And I quote, "We find ontological flux in sound ritual manifested through transformation, experienced directly or vicariously through either metamorphosis or mimesis, and acted out through ritual, either altered states of consciousness informed through the trance dance or liminality experienced through initiation rites." End quote. Guenther has analyzed San cosmology's understanding of human-animal relations through the lens of the new animistic complex, where he extrapolates ontological fluidity or flux into three separate but interrelated ontological domains of being. The first is identified as the world beyond, a domain of mythological time comprised of mythological beings where the ontology of all animate beings is unfixed and ever-changing. The second is the here and now, which is the present, where ontological boundaries exist between humans and other than humans, in that the formation of beings is fixed through naming. Guenther argues that it is the interaction between these domains during activities like hunting and tracking that transspecies ontological fluidity can occur. And it is here that we see the adaptive posthumanist potential of this prehumanist technology. Guenther draws from numerous scholars in new animism and relational animism, including Ingold, to demonstrate a San relational ontology, which I have argued elsewhere is congruent with Deleuze and Guattari's theory of becoming and becoming animal. An important distinction here is that in San animism, ontological fluidity or flux goes beyond the animistic understanding of relational ontology. In that, animistic relational ontology distinguishes the shared interiority of spirit or soul between the human, non-human, from discontinuous and distinct exteriority. In contrast, in San animism's ontology of flux, there is an extension of human-animal continuity, a becoming, so to speak, in the mutability of the interior and exterior of San ontology that extends to the realm of the here and now. There, and I quote, are moments at which the ontological ambiguity and instability of humans and non-humans that are manifest in myth and ritual also enter humans' awareness in real life in the real world, end quote. Using the example of hunting specifically, Guenther writes that, quote, at the face of it, San hunting is indeed a secular activity, a subsistence pattern that is practical, pragmatic, and strategic, based on observation and empirical knowledge and practical skill. And for San, who give importance to shifting ways of experientially being in the world, end quote, hunting, like storytelling and trancing, can be experienced as a form of ritual, ritualized through the convergence of the three domains of being and through the boundary crossing that it facilitates from one ontological realm of being to another. In People of the Eland, Winnecombe points out that the symbolic prominence of antelope in San rock art, oral tradition, and myth demonstrates the spiritual and religious significance of hunting, human-animal relations, and human-animal hybridity in San society. Guenther explains that, quote, as meat and metaphor, animals fill the collective Bushman's stomach and mind. They are eaten and talked about with relish and are as prominent in Bushman religious and expressive culture as they are or once were in the Kalahari landscape, end quote. Animals as meat and metaphor demonstrate an active, practical, and perceptual ontology of dwelling in place. Ingold believes that the hunter-gatherer legacy calls for the postmodern human, quote, to be that of a being immersed from the start, like other creatures, in an active, practical, and perceptual engagement with constituents of a dwelt-in world, end quote. Lowe's recent work supports Ingold's notion of an ontology based on perceptual engagements with constituents of a dwelt-in world. Lowe, in my understanding, advocates that a hunter-gatherer ontology, for example, is informed by somatic symbolic engagement with one's environment. This allows us to reimagine a more embodied and inclusive approach to the historical development of human consciousness. Lowe's argument de-emphasizes a human-centered approach to the development of consciousness, emphasizing instead the evolution of the human as part of the conscious ecology of Earth. Lowe argues that the premise of a sudden human revolution of consciousness creates a superficial division between humans and the rest of the ecological and biological world. Coming back to Liebenberg, Liebenberg states that, quote, trackers identify themselves with that animal by thinking what they would do if they became that animal. End quote. This leads us back to our argument that the art of tracking demonstrates that knowledge is not the result of an intellectual experience alone. It is also the product of an ever-emergent somatic experience that is ontologically ambiguous. Trackers and hunters spend many hours somatically embracing and becoming intimate with different aspects of their ecological environment. For a SAN tracker, knowing how to hunt an animal does not merely entail a theoretical understanding of the scientific anomalies of that animal. Rather, it involves an experiential knowledge of how that animal breathes and moves with its environment. Scholars most commonly discuss human and other than human transformation among the San within the context of San myth, rites of passage, or within the trance or healing dance context. With hunting and tracking, scholars commonly refer to bodily tappings or presentiments, which are well-recorded phenomena in 19th century archives and in the ethnographies of any contemporary San scholar who has analyzed San tracking and hunting practices. The word presentiment is usually associated with an intuitive feeling about something that is to come. In this instance, and is indicated by the term bodily tappings, presentiments for the San are somatic intuitions about the movements and whereabouts of animals. They can express themselves internally as pure intuition or externally, which is when they are more commonly referred to as bodily tappings. Guenther, whose analysis of presentiments more directly focuses on the relationship of these to transformation and ontological fluidity within San's experiences, defines tappings as the moment where the hunter-animal's sense of connectedness peaks through somatic stirrings in certain parts of the hunter's body. Guenther argues that in lived San experiences, there is a multidimensionality of time and space. And here, multiple natures coexist, necessitating ontological mutability in, quote, a boundaryless universe whose entangled people and animals move across time and space, end quote. Sugawara supports Guenther's theory in explaining that in contrast to Ingold's view, San ontology, quote, refuses the presumption that a uniform plane of nature covers all over the earth, admitting that multiple natures exist, each of which strictly coincides with an indigenous ontology, end quote. In San animism, mythology and ritual are purposeful punctuations of a dwelt-in world, allowing for multiple planes of existence to coexist. Duplessis describes the relationship between the tracker-hunter and animal as one of landscape companions becoming with each other, describing tracking as a process-orientated practice of becoming with emergent landscapes and their multiple potentialities, not just the relationship between a human tracker and tracked animal. Sussman explains that as much as hunting is a practice that is reliant on tracking, tracking is about much more than hunting. Quote, to be a good tracker requires engaging in a constant physical dialogue with the environment and ultimately an ability to project oneself into the animals that left the tracks, end quote. What this means is that for the San, it is entirely plausible to experience, quote, in merging somatically with the animal as the hunter runs its track, the identity and otherness of the human and other than human dissolve into each other, end quote. In closing, on a scientific and epistemological level, tracking supports an earth-centered radical eminence that actively decenters human exceptionalism in the orchestration of sentient planetary affairs. Through the art and practice of tracking, the prehumanistic expression of being human is understood as one species participating in a multi-species orchestra of trans-species co-emergence through the ontological openings that ontological ambiguity and fluidity afford. This presentation concludes that the trans-species sentience experience during tracking through this process informs a metaphysics of becoming Earth, where a post-humanist future depends on a pre-humanist understanding of interspecies consciousness. Thank you.